In the interest of time, I just want to get right to it. So I'm going to have all of the panelists introduce themselves very quickly, and then we'll have a few short presentations, and then hopefully leave the remainder of the time for me to ask some questions, and then for you all to ask some questions. So get ready with some good questions. Patrick. Introduce yourself.
Hi, everybody. I'm Patrick Odolini, Chief Resilience Officer and Director of Earthquake Safety for the City and County of San Francisco.
Hi, I'm Lucy Jones, retired.
Leslie Chapman Henderson, Federal Alliance for Safe Homes.
David Bonowitz, I'm a structural engineer and a consultant to, among other cities, San Francisco.
Fantastic. Now Patrick's going to start.
It's so nice to sit next to my recently unemployed colleague here. I was thinking about that as Mike Galoli was showing the unemployment statistics from Christchurch. So much like what you just heard from Mike and my colleague to my right, Marissa Aho, we're part of an effort launched by the Rockefeller Foundation, looking at 100 different cities throughout the globe to try to see what it really means to be a resilient city and build on work that a lot of these high-capacity cities are already doing. Just about a week and a half ago, on the 110th anniversary of the 1906 earthquake, we released our resilience strategy. Resilient San Francisco, stronger today, stronger tomorrow. As a frame, we wanted to try to frame it thinking about all of the existing mitigation work, all the existing planning that we're doing is very good in San Francisco, but we also had to think about it in terms of capacity. We're a city of about 850,000 residents, and by 2040, all estimates indicate that we'll be a city of 1 million. So when we're thinking about things like housing 95% of our citizens after a disaster, we have to build in that additional capacity as our population grows. As you can imagine, a resilience strategy is a really daunting thing to think about. There's so many hazards you can choose from, and I think all of us struggle a lot in writing this because if you try to look at everything, you're going to be a mile wide and an inch deep. So you have to choose some areas to have some depth around. In our strategy, we actually focus on 6 different hazards. So we look at earthquakes, we look at climate change, we look at sea level rise, we look at aging infrastructure, social inequity, and unaffordability. The way we decided to try to address those was through 4 bold goals: to plan and prepare for tomorrow, to mitigate, adapt, and retrofit, to ensure housing for San Franciscans today and after a disaster, to empower neighbors and neighborhoods through improved connections. The idea in our basic methodology here is these larger 4 goals, and under each one of those goals are actions. These are kind of our aspiration and what we really want to achieve with this. And then underneath one of those, there's actually separate initiatives. The plan itself has 54 individual initiatives that now are going to have metrics associated with them and will be measured annually with an update to this plan. Chapter 1, as I mentioned, Plan and Prepare for Tomorrow, has several actions. Plan today for San Francisco's recovery. There's a lot of people in the room that have really contributed to a lot of this, and I want to recognize Lori Johnson as well. We've adopted a goal of trying to keep 95% of our people in San Francisco. This is a very tricky thing. This is not a one-size-fits-all approach. This is not going to be one magic system that allows us to do this. It's going to be a multifaceted approach of trying to figure out how we keep our people in San Francisco so we can kickstart our recovery. A lot of this work has also been looked at through the San Francisco's Lifelines Council, which issued an interdependency study in 2014 looking at restoration timelines. And so looking at those interdependencies has allowed us to kind of think and actually involve the private sector much more in this planning process when we think about recovery. Action 2 is Advance Innovations in Earthquake Preparedness. This deals with a lot of the seismic policy that San Francisco has been leading for a lot of years. Many of you are familiar with the CAPS program, Community Action Plan for Seismic Safety, and our 30-year Earthquake Safety Implementation Program. When we released the resilience strategy, we certainly didn't want to ignore these efforts. We had to figure out a way to incorporate and honor those and advance those through this process. Action 3, Invest in Infrastructure and Transportation for our growing city. Again, getting to the capacity issue of trying to design for SF at 1 million. Goal 2, Retrofit, Mitigate, and Adapt. This involves retrofitting our city's remaining seismically dangerous buildings. So many of you are familiar with our soft story program, which currently has a 99.99% compliance rate. And by 2020, 120,000 San Franciscans are going to live in a building retrofitted under this program. It's just one small bite at a very big apple, but we're very proud of that success. The Soft Story program, many of you in this room have been involved in it, and it's not just a seismic upgrade program. This is a very holistic approach at looking at how we keep residents in their homes during construction, how we're making sure we're not displacing our vulnerable residents in the middle of the worst housing crisis we've ever seen. So it quickly becomes a social issue and not just an engineering problem. The other action to retrofit and rebuild seismically hazardous infrastructure. Many of you have seen the press coming out about the city's seawall in the last couple of weeks as we do our seismic vulnerability study on probably the largest piece of infrastructure in San Francisco that most people don't even know exists. Very pleased to see that just yesterday, Mayor Lee announced $8 million going to master planning to address this issue. We're going to continue to lead the world in greenhouse gas mitigation. We know that as a city, if we change our behavior, we're not going to change the planet. But it's an important thing to focus on that behavior change. And as we start to look towards adaptation methods to deal with climate change, I think they go hand in hand. As we adapt for climate change, we have to be thinking about this. I mean, this is where we really get into dealing with co-benefits. You just heard me mention the seismic vulnerability of the seawall. But we can't just build a seawall to withstand an earthquake. If we're not addressing sea level rise, we're not being smart with our budget dollars here. We recently released a sea level rise action plan. We did that with the work of RMS to understand what's at risk. And the takeaway from that is we have a little over $75 billion of public and private assets that are subject to inundation by 2100. Ensure housing for San Franciscans today and after a disaster. This is a real important one. San Franciscans are having a hard time being able to afford their units as it is today. And so we know that if we have a disaster and people have to move outside of the city, the chances of them coming back go down each single day. So trying to keep our people in San Francisco after a disaster is critical. We did a lot of work with Doug Allers and the Harvard Kennedy School over the last year to understand what are the things we should be thinking about during an interim housing period of that 18-month to 5 years after the disaster. And also with the 100 Resilient Cities Network, being able to talk to people like Mike Galoli, being able to talk to my counterpart Jeffy Bear in New Orleans, to get a feel of even though these might be different disasters, how does the housing bounce back? What do you have to do? What are the tricks? What are the tools? To enhance systems to rapidly house San Franciscans. The picture there is actually a picture of our Homeless Navigation Center, which was piloted last year, taking chronically homeless people and finding permanent housing. Systems like this can be scaled up after a disaster, and so if we perfect this method now, it's ultimately going to help us bounce back and house our citizens afterwards. Strengthening housing now to prepare us better for tomorrow. San Francisco has been not keeping up with our housing production for the last 3 or 4 decades. So we have a deficit now, and that's driving a lot of the unaffordability. So focusing on housing production, but resilient housing production is key. Empower neighborhoods through improved connections. This means a couple of different things. You know, as a city, or any of you who work in government, I think we often have a hard time trying to reach our people, trying to reach our citizens, and I think the citizens have the same level of frustration trying to reach back. So we really wanted to focus on that connection, but also the connections that residents have to one another in their community. We want to do this by building strong and healthy connected neighborhoods. We want to do this by improving access to San Francisco government. And one of the key initiatives coming out of this is a new office that we just established a week and a half ago, the Office of Resilience and Recovery, which the mayor named me the director of. So now we have a way to implement this in a long-term way in San Francisco. And what's important here is I think a lot of times, and even the 100 Resilient Cities effort is guilty of this, is they focus on an individual, a chief resilience officer. This never lives with one person. This is not one person's job. Because when cities do that, the success is directly dependent on the success of that individual, and that's not sustainable. So by creating an Office of Resilience and Recovery, it's a way to incorporate this for years and hopefully decades to come in the city of San Francisco. I will pass it now to my recently unemployed colleague, Lucy Jones.
I think actually David
Oh, excuse me, David Bonowitz, my currently employed colleague, David Bonowitz. Thank you very much, everybody.
Well, I'm going to make an executive decision and skip through this. And just get to the end. We are so far behind time, and the Q&A is going to be so much more interesting and important in a meeting like this. So what I'm going to do is watch the screen. If you see anything that looks intriguing to you and you want to hear more about it, just find me later, and we'll talk about this because there's important stuff here. But I want to give you 5 lessons from my work with San Francisco, Oakland, Berkeley, and other places about thinking about transitioning from safety-based engineering to resilience-based engineering and what that means. And I'm going to give you 5 lessons. I got a 6th bonus lesson if you're really good, and we get to that in the Q&A. But I'm going to, again, get to the end here and just cover that. First lesson, know what we're talking about when we're talking about resilience. It's about recovery time. It's a new way of thinking, and it means new things to us as engineers. It's different from safety. Be very careful about someone trying to sell you a resilient building or a resilient structural system or a resilient material. Resilience is an attribute of organizations. Safety, economy, recovery, reoccupancy, those are attributes of buildings that we can predict as engineers. Resilience is an attribute of an organization. When we're thinking about public policy, the organization of interest is the whole community. These folks, today on this panel, we're talking about the resilience of a community. In order to get to that point, you need two things. One, you need to know your building stock. So if there's an overarching theme in these 5 lessons, it's probably this. We have to avoid the temptation as we shift from safety-based engineering to resilience-based design, resist the temptation. Engineers love to copy and paste. We need to resist the temptation to copy and paste from what we do in one community to what will work in another community. It's not going to work. We have to resist the temptation to take what we used to do when we were thinking about safety and just strike the word safety and put in the word recovery or resilience. It will not work. So you have to know your building stock, which is different from city to city. San Francisco has particular things to it that do not apply in Long Beach or in Eureka or in other parts of the country. You have to know your community because buildings, again, are something that engineers can deal with, but resilience is the attribute of the community. And resilience, interestingly, one way in which it really differs from safety is that resilience requires mandates. The reason is that you can, as in a building, you have some control for the most part over the safety of your building. You do not have control over the recovery of your organization. It is too bound up with other things, and that means that it is subject to what economists call the tragedy of the commons, because it's a communal action problem. And this is why you cannot incentivize your way to resilience the way we can towards safety of individual buildings. So resilience requires mandates. And finally, who's going to do this? Patrick just diffused this and said, don't put it all on one individual. But I think the lesson here is that we're all in this room pretty much activists. All the engineers and people and experts in this room are activists. And if you have in your community someone who can spend 20 or 30 years as a technical expert, make themselves known to the public, establish a fantastic reputation, and work well with the media, fantastic. You've got Lucy Jones. It is not a repeatable strategy. Okay? No, it has worked. If you have Lawrence Cornfield in San Francisco or Arietta Chakos in Berkeley, that can work, but I cannot recommend to you if you're trying to think about how to do this now in your jurisdiction. It's not a reliable strategy. A much better strategy is actually have a charismatic mayor. Also, not exactly something you can count on. So the one thing, and I'm critical of the Rockefeller Foundation a little bit, but the one thing that I really like about them is that they identified that you need someone who is not the building official, not the fire marshal, not even the emergency manager, whose job it is to think about this stuff long term. Eventually it has to be mainstreamed into an office the way Patrick talked about, but it has to start with identifying someone on your community's org chart who is thinking about these issues in a way that we haven't thought about them before. So I'll leave it with that as the 5th lesson, and if we get to the bonus, you can ask me later.
Dr. Jones. That one or this one?
I'll go here. Okay. Thank you all. It's really quite extraordinary to see what's going on in San Francisco. It's an effort that's been going on for over a decade. It's a very groundswell, bottom-up approach. LA hasn't done real well on a bottom-up approach. We don't have a civic memory of a big disaster. We think Northridge is as bad as it gets. So we took a different approach, and we ended up with a partnership where I spent a year in LA City Hall. I won't say that's what made me retire, but it was a tiring process. And created a plan called Resilience by Design, in which we, took the effort, brought in the technical side, all the people I knew that I roped into doing this. The mayor's staff put up 20 people that met with me every week, came up with an approach to say, here's what the problem is, and here are our solutions. And then I got to leave, and Marissa got hired to actually carry it out, which is not a bad way of doing it, at least from my point of view. we could spend a lot of time, more than we've got, trying to go through all of this. I want to take David's inspiration and just give you a couple of the big points. But I'm going to sort of look, rather than what are the lessons out of it, what was it that worked? Why did we get people to listen? And it's actually some of the same things that they're saying, is we didn't focus on dying. You aren't going to die in the earthquake. You're more likely to die, be murdered by quite a bit. And in fact, you're about as likely to be shot by a toddler as you are to die in an earthquake as an American. So that's not the big issue. The issue is living, and living after the earthquake when life has become really miserable. And so we defined urban disaster resilience, a society that could still function after the earthquake, and looked at what would be necessary to do that. And my favorite graph that worked really well, and I know Lori Johnson complains about me comparing New Orleans to Nashville for reasons, but it's a very effective graph. At the time of Hurricane Katrina, New Orleans was a bit larger than Nashville in terms of GDP. In the 7 years after it, they lost $105 billion in lost GDP if you assumed that they would have kept up regionally with Nashville if it's a similar economy in the region. But bottom line here is that recovery, that process that happens after the earthquake, is where the losses really happen. If you can get back up and get going, you've got a system that would work. If you can't get the system working again, you end up as a smaller city, and you end up just with lost productivity, lost everything. That question of, what Patrick was saying, how do we keep 95% of our population in place? That is a really audacious goal. And, so for instance, in the city of Los Angeles, knowing that we have over 13,000 soft first-story apartments, if we lose them as places to live, that we will lose our affordable housing, right? So this isn't about dying in that apartment building. Obviously, that would be a really bad thing. It happened in Northridge Meadows. We're trying to prevent that. But we need to get beyond thinking of this as a life safety issue and start thinking about it as an economic issue. That has some implications for how we're approaching it in the long run. Engineers have had life safety goals. If I could wave my magic wand across the United States and change one thing, it would be to get communities to look at having an immediate occupancy goal for their buildings, because if we just make sure we don't die in that building, we aren't recovering our economy. What we did in focusing in Los Angeles on what has the potential for catastrophic failure, we sort of went through the shakeout that I gather that Tom Jordan was talking about yesterday in rather dramatic terms, and looked at where things actually fell apart. And we've identified these 5 areas. If we don't have water, if the fire runs through the place, if nobody can live here, if you can't go to work here, and if you can't communicate, we're going to have trouble keeping the economy going. So we came up with a set of recommendations. There's 18 recommendations across 3 big categories, 6 of them around how to fortify our water system. That's probably the single scariest thing in Los Angeles. 88% of our water comes in from outside the region, and that means, and every drop of that is crossing the San Andreas in one of 4 aqueducts that are all going to break in the earthquake. We also looked at how to strengthen our buildings. One thing is make sure we don't die. That's going to be bad for the economy too. But also then how do we try and get our buildings usable after the event through a variety of approaches of getting people to recognize that life safety doesn't mean usable. And then also looking at communications issues. I think that we went into this thinking it might be a bigger problem than it turned out to be, not to say that there aren't some pretty significant issues. The biggest one, our cell towers have 4 hours of backup power. So for 4 hours after the earthquake, you're going to be able to get some text through. You won't be able to get cell service, but you'll be able to get some text through, and after 4 hours, they're gone. So there's a variety of things that can be done with that. Again, all of these have been undertaken. Anything that required legislative activity has passed City Council unanimously. So we changed the dynamic, we got people to do it, and I really think we did it by focusing on not the life safety issues, but on what it was going to do to our economy. So we got building owners agreeing to be given mandates to spend $5 billion because they realized the problem wasn't so much their building as what happened to their neighbor's building. And on that, hand it to Leslie. I think there's actually one more slide.
Oh,
Think about
you
it.
got one more?
No, I don't need it. It's just.
All right. Okay, so I have a slightly different job here, and I want to just say, first of all, our organization, I put this in so you understand, we have a very unique seat at this table of the U.S. and the globe in terms of kind of trend spotting, how things are going. And I think it's very clear, and you've already heard, and I think you all know, that California and the West Coast is leading the United States in every level. I've never been accused of being a pessimist. I don't make lemons, I make lemonade, but I have to be a little bit of a reality check on how we're doing everywhere else. So what I'm going to talk about today is some of the things that are happening with one of the most basic aspects to resilience, a building block, not the whole thing, but building codes. And building codes are kind of like the Maytag repairman. Everyone goes, yeah, of course, of course, of course. We have to have building codes. You guys have great building codes. Unfortunately, that's just not the case everywhere else. So when we look at the conference theme, what's new, what's next, that's the stuff that's happening here. What's your role in a national strategy? That's where we all kind of need to come together on building codes, and that's what I'm going to talk a little bit about because we're going to have to do better. We're not just not enacting seismic building codes in seismic zones across the U.S., we are actually retreating and turning back the clock in some of those high-risk zones. So that's one of the goals I have for this gathering in the next 4 years is to do better on that front. So here's some of our observations on what's out there. Obviously, code development is going pretty well, okay? And all the things we talked about yesterday, USGS insights and new maps and all those pieces are making their way into the model codes. That's the good news, okay? As I just said, California, Florida, Virginia, hi Matt Wall, I can go home now, doing a very good job with statewide building codes and keeping them current, okay? Unfortunately, even post-disaster, looking at Alabama, which never had a residential code until the 2011 outbreak of Tuscaloosa and the tornadoes, even then, when they finally got their first ever residential building code, the enforcement is voluntary. And there's no funding. So we've got some problems because net, what does that mean? They don't have a residential building code. Ditto Mississippi. We've got a little bit of code down on the coast, but it's spotty. And again, remember, I make lemonade, so I'm allowed to, be a truth teller here today. But if you go to some places where the building code hearing is happening, the sign is changed on the door, the room assignment is unpublished, and it's just not out in what we call in Florida, government in the sunshine. So we've got some problems out there, not necessarily in code development, but when it comes to adoption and enforcement and the resources, we have big issues. I really enjoyed the remarks yesterday by our speaker from Irving, Texas. We also have a lot of work we're doing in Texas because we do have building codes in the jurisdictions of Texas. But outside those jurisdictions in the county, or as I've been taught to say, by hanging out in Texas, in the county, it's voluntary. Okay, so that net, there's no building code. All right, so I think these cases, these instances, and these scenarios are important for all of us to look at and be reminded because I think that they're harbingers of bad things to come. One of the things that's happening actively is, as I said, we're losing the resources. And it's not that anybody ever sits down and says, I want a bad building, but it's just the way it is. There aren't enough resources to go around. And if you haven't had an event to create a stark reminder of why you need to have sturdy buildings using the most innovative current model codes, then your resources are going to be spent on something else. So it's not intentional, it's just the way it is. But we have another problem. We do have interest groups out there who don't want a building code. They don't want to be told how to build. So they've come up with some kind of nifty tricks. One of them is to skip the code update cycles. Okay, so North Carolina has now legislated that now code development, every 3 years we get all the new insights, and there's no better lab than a large-scale disaster than the disaster that tells us what went wrong. I remember in '92 what we learned, coming out of Andrew, and every big disaster we go, okay, Now we know we had 112,000 failures of gable end walls, so we're going to do that differently, and we put that in the code. So when you skip a cycle, you're missing out on those insights, and we have states like North Carolina that have decided they don't want the latest thing. You know, we've argued against that, like your iPhone. You know what happens if you skip those updates eventually? Like I tried to explain to my 84-year-old mother about her iPad. Nada. You have no iPad functioning. Minnesota, I think, and I didn't confirm this, I think they went to a 9-year cycle. So you take the lag time, the administrative tail, 9 years by statute, so you're basically going to mandate yourself to be 12 to 15 years behind, okay? Florida, which you would have never thought it, and this is one of the reasons I've become a little bit alarmed, Florida, after the Andrew experience, has been hailed for the best high wind codes in the nation and as a leader. But a mere 4 days before the conclusion of this year's legislative session, somebody snuck a little amendment in, which was not successful, but it would have pushed Florida to a 6-year cycle. This is institutionalized barriers to progress. And why? Okay? So this is going on. Places like Michigan, they're taking pieces out and really ugly surgery with bad stitches, and basically it's leaving our building codes. You know, we talk about the building code is a minimum for just life safety, never mind an aspirational goal of resilience for a whole community to bounce back and have economic vitality. You know I'm just like beating the drum here, but if we can't get the code right, we can't ever get to that aspiration, okay? So I'm going to talk a little bit about Memphis because I think it's particularly relevant to seismic, and then I'll tell you what we think is next and where you fit in. So this is kind of an old story, but it's an ongoing story. Memphis had not updated their codes for seismic in 19 years, and in 2012 we were asked if we would leverage our identity. And I think that the point there is that if you think about building codes, one of the barriers to good building codes is that a lot of the people that can advance good building codes have to maintain a good relationship with the home building industry. And often the home building industry, because they don't want to continuously have to change the way they build, it's understandable, and they're worried about cost, also understandable, they do not want to see the codes change. So Memphis had fallen way behind. They had a state law. They were supposed to keep up with 6 years. They were at 19. We made a very logical case. Logic doesn't help here all the time. For all these reasons, codes work. They save lives, economic development, as well as preservation. The community piece. We wrote a piece in the paper in 12 on the eve of the vote. They finally read the thing, and it was kind of a shaming, I'll just say it, and they adopted the code. So they updated the code. I started getting letters like this from engineers, and I don't want to fail to say that the reason that this happened is we had engineers on the ground, one woman in particular who actually lost business for her consultancy because of her, and we've had her speak. Janelle, I think you've met Julie. She spoke out and had contracts canceled in her community because she spoke out in favor of the strong code. These engineers are terrified that the buildings they're building are going to collapse, and at the same time, they can't compete on cost if somebody else is willing to build it to the 19-year, pre-Northridge building code. So we started getting letters from people saying, help, help, our buildings are going to crumble. So since 2012, we've been working and trying to keep Memphis intact because we did get the IRC and the IBC in place. Lots of efforts have been put on to change the law so they don't have to update the code. That's been thwarted. The commercial code there is still intact. The IRC has been watered down. It's a problem. We're trying to do education around that. But it's because nothing's happened that they aren't getting that reminder. So a couple things before I wrap up, and then this is really just an invitation and somewhat of a plea. One, let's not forget that not every state is California. And two, this has to be one of the things that comes out of this conference. And this goal has to be set. We can't overlook the codes. We're working on a project because if you follow the ATC 117, and Jack Hayes talked yesterday about the MIT flag and all the effort there, clearly local leaders are the linchpin. So we've got an effort going on with FEMA to do a nationwide outreach effort to help them understand why the codes matter. And then there's one other kind of novel thing that's been going on that we're going to formalize. When we won in Florida, it's not because we have lobbyists or anybody that has all those local relationships. It's because our corporate partners do. So we're going to formalize a very informal, kind of an intelligence network, and you know, we send up the flare, help, you know, let's not let the code get derailed. We're going to formalize this relationship with the insurance industry advocacy community because they've saved our bacon in Memphis, in Florida, in Michigan, in Pennsylvania, and all over the U.S. They're doing it very quietly. We're not going to broadcast it beyond you guys. But we're going to create a more systemic way to take expert information, get it into the hands of the people with the relationship, and make the case for strong building codes. So that is kind of my bit for today. We've written about this, and I can share these papers. I know it's kind of like the story that won't go away, but guess what? If we don't have building codes, there will never be resilience.
Can I make a quick point
Yeah.
about building codes?
Of course.
I didn't mention, one thing I do among my too many committees is I chair the existing buildings committee for the National Council of Structural Engineers Associations, NCSEA, and I was just in Louisville for 2 weeks of code hearings. Is there anybody here from NAHB? So the National Association of Home Builders, there's building codes for new construction, there's building codes for existing construction. At the hearings in Louisville not 2 weeks ago, NAHB successfully put forward a proposal to exempt all existing 1 and 2 family dwellings and townhouses from all of the upgrade triggers for seismic, wind, and snow that are currently in the IEBC. That's still open to some debate, but it's going to be very hard to reverse. So what they're saying is, if you have an existing house, it's under the IRC only. The IRC has no triggers at all for upgrade. That could happen. So something about existing building codes in addition to building codes for new construction, but Leslie and I are together on this.
Excellent. So in all of these situations, opportunities to educate the community and have an ongoing dialogue are really important. Have any of you found successful ways to either start or continue that conversation?
With
The community, to have advocates sort of step up and push.
Well, I'm going to throw this to Patrick and Lucy because they hinted at different models. And as somebody who works with multiple communities, the one thing I find is the engineering is uniform, but every community that I've worked with has kind of a different political culture. And the idea that San Francisco took 10 years of hand-holding and consensus building, and Los Angeles came in and a year later had 2 retrofit ordinances, they couldn't have worked in different ways. So I want to hear about the outreach that San Francisco did, which we would never think of doing it any other way. And Lucy, would it be fair to say that you got around that, or you did it a different way?
We partly capitalized on San Francisco. Los Angeles, look at what they've done. Do you really want to be behind them? And maybe I shouldn't completely admit this, but there was a big deal. Can we say this is the first one? You're going to need to do concrete then. Okay, we're going to do concrete. Because you guys already did, they didn't want to just be playing catch up to San Francisco. So there was an aspect of that. I guess I see a couple of things going on, and one of them I think is encouraging for all of us. In general, people will deal with the disaster they can remember, right? Psychologists call it the normalization bias, and if it's happened in the last 20 years, that's something that you expect, and if it's longer than that, you really start to wonder. I guess on the outside, compared to Los Angeles, San Francisco has a civic memory of catastrophe. You know, it's getting harder to pull out anymore. They're all dead now. But in 1906, you really did set back the economy for a few decades. And your civic structures were made in that system. And we don't have that. The reason to feel some encouragement is that there's a pretty fundamental shift going on in our society. It's called the internet. We've all sort of noticed this, right? A lot of things are changing. You can look at the election cycle and wonder if it was a good thing. But another aspect of this shared communication is that we don't have to have our own disaster anymore. We learn from the disasters elsewhere. And, 1976, 700,000 people, I think, died in the Tangshan earthquake. We still can't figure out exactly how many died. And nobody really noticed. In 2011, with the Great Tohoku, the East Japan earthquake and tsunami, we sat and watched on cable news in real time as the tsunami wave spread across the Sendai Plain. And we watched people struggling to get out of the waters. We watched people losing that struggle, and it made it very, very real. And I think one of the reasons that we got through so quickly, it's not just that we built on San Francisco, is that society is changing and the awareness of disasters is changing because we're sharing it around the world. It's a really positive aspect of globalization, and I think that we're getting traction because we don't have to reach back to an old earthquake. We're watching it right now in another part of the world and believing in it.
But does having a disaster on the internet every 3 days not lead to a little bit of disaster fatigue?
But we don't have a catastrophe every 3 days.
Well,
right?
there's cities around the western part of the United States just about the same size and age as Napa. And I don't know. This is an open
Okay,
question.
Napa didn't do enough damage to really catch people's eyes, right? But Tohoku, where you're taking out the electrical system for the whole country, where you watch 17,000 people, where communities lost 10, 20% of their population dying in that moment. That gets us. See, and it's this weird, the other aspect of it is we care about dying. We can be afraid of dying. We aren't very good at being afraid of being bankrupted. And yet the bankruptcy is the much bigger issue, but it's the life safety issue that has the emotional appeal. So we're sort of trading it off, and it's interesting. To the public, what am I going to vote for? That, those people dying really make a difference. To the businessman, that graph I showed you from New Orleans, I figured out, I made that the last slide of my talk when I went to talk to the community groups, and we'd leave that up there for them to look at and think about as I talked about what LA needed.
Doesn't matter if it's inaccurate, but it's very effective.
You got it.
I want to echo that comment. When we were working in Memphis, we used the safety argument, and that was great. But I think what won the day is the fact that FedEx is headquartered there. And when we talked about the interruption and the business continuity and the interruption of, imagine 3 days without your FedEx, and what the impact of that would have been on the globe. And not because FedEx hasn't built a very, very sturdy set of facilities in Memphis, it's because of the people that work at FedEx and their homes and their inability to get out of their homes, or if they had been injured or killed. And that is one of the arguments that won the day. That and Bass Pro Shops, they have a big headquarters there in Memphis, and they had required their landlord to use California codes to construct their headquarters. So when we wrote about it and advocated, we talked about FedEx and Bass Pro, and why is it good enough for the business to have the sturdy structure, but where does that leave the people? And that worked for a while, but the gets quiet, people go away, and then they quietly move the meeting around, and we can't chase it down, and then the weakening starts. And I called and talked to the coalition in Memphis and got updated before I came here, and they said they're very nervous about the commercial code now, because some really ugly surgeries happening to the residential, never mind what's not happening for the existing buildings. And Memphis, to remember this, another argument we made is during the national level exercise in 2011 in Memphis, when everyone comes together and says, this is our vulnerability, they had self-proclaimed problems in Memphis that they cited as the justification for a lot of federal money. So aging infrastructure, unreinforced masonry construction, and all these different things. So they received $14 million plus in support. I think a case that has to be made is the local jurisdictions can't do everything, and they do lack the resources to do everything, but the one thing they can do is enact a building code. and adopt it and enforce it. And I think, I'm thinking about tomorrow and how we wrap up and how we bring this meeting all together, and I'm going to be writing, I think, like a Magna Carta. So send me your input for it, because I think there's a creed that needs to, if we have this is our definition, and I won't say definition because I've participated in about a dozen different attempts to define resilience in the last several years, like we all have.
I got a better one.
Yeah. So we need to have kind of a state of the state. You have to have this in order to get there. Without this aspect, and it has to include codes, and I think that's one of the pieces. And then I think local officials who may not understand that piece at all, I think that becomes a measurement. We had a mayor's resilience forum for Florida, and we talked about this topic, and they said, good grief, we get measured on everything. The lighting at night, crime, walkability, our restaurants, we're used to that. If you can grade us on our resilience, once you decide what that is, we'll listen. So I think we have opportunities to fix it, but there's definitely a disconnect.
I'll make just one point on this. I keep on saying enforcement of building codes. We need that. There's also a point as we talk about, that response, and you've got to have FedEx working, you've got to have BAS working. Well, it's also a time when we need to have our government working. And one of the biggest loopholes, even here in California with our supposedly great building codes, is that neither state or federal buildings are subject to local building code inspection. There is no independent inspection of either state or federal buildings, here or anywhere else. And so like Los Angeles is looking at all its bad buildings, some of the worst ones are the state buildings. There's nothing Los Angeles can do about them. The retrofit ordinance can't be applied to the state buildings. And basically, in both instances, the project manager who has to follow building codes, but the project manager who has to bring it in under budget gets to decide how much inspection is done.
Anyone else, or we'll move on? I have one more question, and then hopefully we'll have some time for audience questions. And that is that Dr. Jones already talked about her magic wand, which is hilarious because we're starting to think very similarly. Everybody else, if you had a magic wand and could make one thing happen, what would it be? And then I have a follow-up.
Is this personal or professional? Because that could be a pretty varied
Either,
answer.
Patrick.
Get your kids to
At first, I think there's a real easy answer. I'm going to say it, but this isn't my final answer. And usually, someone in my position would say money. Because when you have funds, you can do programs, you have leverage, and that's a cop out. That's not really the answer. What you need is community buy-in. And I think that's essential. We can pass laws all day long. How often do you guys cross the street and jaywalk? You're breaking the law. This happens all the time where we pass laws and people don't follow them. So to get that buy-in, yes, you have to take bold action from a policy standpoint. David, you went over this in your opening remarks talking about this requires passing laws. This requires passing ordinances. To give you an idea, just using the Soft Story program as an example, there's about 5,300 buildings that are subject to this ordinance. When this same demographic of buildings were under a voluntary program, what our numbers were? We're at about 60 buildings. So it just shows that you can show people all the evidence, but sometimes government exists to make that difficult decision for the public, and we don't make it easily, but we have to make that decision to make it so. And then to get people to follow that, you have to have that buy-in or it falls flat on its face.
Leslie or David?
Well, obviously, my magic wand, I'll set, building codes, but the other thing is, if I had a magic wand, I would make every person who rents or builds or buys a home value a beyond code sturdy structure. So we love our aesthetics and all that, but if there were a marketplace where people asked the questions and came in the door and said, okay, what home is this? What code is this home built to? Am I going to survive? Is this just safety or is it performance-based and all that? I want that consumer. My magic wand goes to that consumer to care and value the failure or not of the structure.
So that's about transparency and changing hearts and minds and having buildings, you might even say, rated, and having those ratings be available. There are good ways to do ratings. There are bad ways to do ratings. If you have questions about ratings, please ask me later. Like Patrick, I'm not going to wish for something fantastical like the San Andreas Fault should just seal up. And I'm also not going to waste my wish on something that we're going to get anyway. We have so much momentum going right now that to wish for a program to be successful, it's going to happen. We're going to have that building code change. We are going to move buildings into risk category 4 because we know it can be done and we have that momentum. So my wish, I think, is going to be about the American and the California economy. There is a recession coming, but if we can keep it, let's say, 6 years from now instead of 2 years from now, I'd wish for that somehow, because my biggest fear is that all the activity we got, all the momentum and the community buy-in we have, it could go away when the economy turns bad. And right now, we are making hay while the sun shines, and I want to keep that sun shining for a few more years.
All right, so the follow-up. I'm taking all the wands away. What is the first thing that you need to get your wish now?
We need to have a model code for immediate occupancy. Right now, if a jurisdiction wanted to do it, it isn't out there.
We're going to do it. We have it in San Francisco. We have the tools currently in the model code. I have another longer presentation about how to do that. And organizations that are represented here today, NIST and FEMA and others, are working on how to do that in a sophisticated, techie way. There's a shortcut to that. And I think you're going to see in the next year that San Francisco is going to take some lead on doing this.
And when you make the comment about taking the wands away, so you mean it's just like a regular day then, right? We don't have these things to begin with. And I think that's exactly, David's right. We have another list of things in our 30-year earthquake safety implementation program that we've highlighted in the resilience plan. And this is where the hard work starts. It's not about just going ahead and writing an ordinance. We have to get these people together. Tensions are really high in San Francisco right now around housing, around construction, around development, and really around inequality that we're seeing every single day. So for us to pass ordinances without taking a very thoughtful look at how this impacts our vulnerable residents, how this impacts our economy, these are the things that we need to do, and we're going to be beginning that work next month, so it's very exciting. So yeah, no magic wands involved.
And David, how do we keep the momentum?
Well, you do good work, and you set good examples. And you get people like Patrick, in positions where where the city is committed to do this as more than a temporary 2-year Rockefeller-funded thing that then goes away. So you make a commitment to do that as part of your community organization. Again, it requires activists, it requires charismatic mayors who care about this, and it requires the absence of things that are going to distract attention because something else becomes more important. A quick word about we're starting to hear engineering terms like life safety and immediate occupancy. And yes, we will have and can have a code about that more focuses on immediate occupancy. That sometimes is not doable with your existing buildings. It's just not going to work. So the challenge that we're facing in San Francisco and the approach we're taking is we're taking the existing buildings and we're bumping them up as much as we can. And we're taking the new buildings and we're designing them for as much as we can. They got to work together.
So without my magic wand, boy, that was a short time duration of having one. I was really starting to enjoy that. I think two things, which is what we do already. We have to work on 2 tracks, peacetime strategies and what they call wartime strategies. In peacetime, we're going to continue to formalize our coalition and let our partners that have advocacy prowess help us and at least stop us from falling behind while we boost the communication and make sure people understand building codes aren't automatic and they are minimum. They're not everything. And then the wartime strategy is to be ready. There's, big change that comes post-catastrophe. So do we have our lists in place? Do we have all of the, that's sometimes, sadly, that's the only way we get a building code. So we need to make sure that all those strategies are ready to mount and push forward so that it doesn't take 18 months post-MAT report and other things to get the change that we needed, because we can't put the earthquake on hold. We can't hit pause.
All right, questions from the audience? If not, I've got a dozen more.
Hi, I'm from Oregon. For those of you in the room that don't know, Oregon is going through this process. We're way behind. Actually, Pacific Northwest in general is going through this process, but we're way behind California. in that we don't have the earthquake culture. So engineers in both Oregon and Washington have pushed through and put together resilience plans. And in Oregon, we actually went through and wrote a bill to put a resilience officer in. We have a resilience officer. Okay, excuse me. We have the position for the resilience officer. The governor's office is starting to go forward. My question is what we're running into as engineers is, as much as we have an Office of emergency management is vital. Resilience is the point of not needing emergency management. So how have you had success in your cities changing the discussion from how do we deal with the aftermath of a terrible earthquake to how do we make it better so that we don't have to deal with that aftermath? How do you change the conversation to get the governor's office, et cetera, to understand that it's not an emergency management problem, that it's an infrastructure and resilience issue?
I think that's a great question, and I think what you're talking about when you say emergency managers or an emergency management division, that could actually be transferred to multiple city departments. We could say the same thing about a building department, about a planning department. These are all people that play a role really in mitigation, response, and recovery. Typically seismic policy, especially when we're talking about the building codes, logical place for it to come out of is a building department. But typically building departments are not good at doing this type of policy work. It's not a good fit. So typically what you want to do in something like that is you create something that's different. You create a different structure so they're allowed to move nimbly throughout the city and interdepartmentally. I think that's what this piece of resilience that we're all trying to do really gets at. It's not our job to be the head of emergency management, but it's my job to work really closely with the head of emergency management. It's not my job to be the building official, but it's my job to make sure the building official is not only working with me, but also working with emergency management and making sure that tie happens, because we're so fragmented, especially in our larger cities, because we have our own kingdoms. And those kingdoms don't interact too often. So I think that's our challenge. It's not to be the expert, but to be that conduit.
Well, the question is, how did you get your job in the first place? How did San Francisco move to that place of being able to do that? And it's an ongoing challenge. Marissa's got the job, and she's reporting to the deputy mayor for public safety. She got put into that box because it's the way people think of earthquakes. And I think I wish I had a better answer, but I think you've hit the most important question there is, because as long as we see it as an emergency management issue, it's always in competition with the next fire truck. And it's also, you don't get the business community behind the solutions when they see it as emergency management. They've got to see this as business development.
And I'm going to say that you have an opportunity as an emergency manager or someone who does think about that. A lot of the things that we borrowed, and I skipped through them in my slides about putting together a timeline of recovery, that comes from a lesson that we as engineers learned from the emergency management community, that things recover on time. And even if you spend all of your time thinking about response and recovery, you have the advantage of knowing about the mitigation cycle. Mitigation, response, recovery work together, and you can make this point whenever you're talking about response and recovery. If you can't afford to do mitigation, you better be able to respond and recover. If you think you're not going to recover, you better be doing mitigation. Those things work together.
Great. And I'm going to thank our panel, not only for the amazing information, but for putting us back on time. Join me, please.